My name is Peter Sullivan. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside conference rooms with frosted glass walls, places where decisions are made quietly and responsibility is assigned even more quietly. On paper, I've always been easy to summarize, dependable, analytical, not particularly loud. The kind of person who gets described as solid instead of exceptional. The kind you trust to clean up a mess, not the kind you imagine making one. People tend to underestimate me, not in a cruel way, more in a convenient way. I don't interrupt. I listen. I take notes when others speak in conclusions. Over time, that turns into an assumption that I'm there to support the story, not change it. That I'm present, but not pivotal. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposure for the sake of humiliation. And it's not about a sudden moment of bravery where someone stands up and shouts the truth. It's about something much quieter than that. It begins the day I secretly recorded a closed-door meeting and heard the CEO planning to make me the scapegoat for his misconduct. I wasn't meant to hear it. That part is important. The meeting wasn't hostile. No one raised their voice. There was no dramatic language. It was procedural, calm, almost polite. And that's what made it so unsettling. As the recording played back later, it became clear I wasn't part of the discussion at all. I was the exit strategy, already chosen to take the fall for mistakes that were never mine. What follows is not a story of immediate confrontation. There was no slamming door, no righteous speech. In fact, for a long time, nothing seemed to change on the surface. I still showed up the same way, still nodded, still did my job. But internally, something shifted. This is a story about quiet dominance, about what happens when silence stops being a weakness and becomes a choice, about how power often moves not through force, but through timing and documentation and restraint, about how people reveal themselves most clearly when they think you're invisible. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through that transformation, who I was to them, the small cuts that didn't seem to matter at the time, the role I was expected to play, the moment I realized I had leverage, and the discipline it took not to use it too early. You'll hear how consequences began long before anyone noticed, and how by the time panic set in, there was nothing left to negotiate. I'm telling this now not to dramatize it, and not to settle scores, but because there's a particular kind of injustice that thrives on our instinct to stay agreeable. And there's a particular kind of strength that only shows up when you refuse to perform the role someone else wrote for you. So before we go any further, let me ask you something. Gently and without judgment, have you ever realized a little too late that you weren't part of the plan? Were you part of the cover? To understand how everything unfolded, you have to understand who I was to them long before anything went wrong. I wasn't invisible in the literal sense. People knew my name, they greeted me in the hallways, they trusted me with sensitive projects. But I existed in a narrow space, useful, dependable, and quietly replaceable. I was the person you looped in after decisions were made, not the one you invited to shape them. In meetings, I sat slightly off-center. Not at the head of the table, not pushed to the edges either. Close enough to be involved, far enough to be overlooked. When questions came up about process, risk, or compliance, heads turned toward me automatically. I answered clearly, concisely, without embellishment. That became my reputation, the guy who brings clarity without bringing friction. Over time, that reputation hardened into expectation. If something needed fixing, I fixed it. If something needed documenting, I documented it. If an uncomfortable email needed to be sent, I drafted it carefully so no one else had to absorb the discomfort. And because I never complained, because I never attached ego to outcomes, people began to assume I didn't need credit, or worse, that I didn't want it. They mistook restraint for lack of ambition. Executives liked me because I didn't threaten them, I didn't posture, I didn't compete for airtime. When discussions drifted into ethically grey territory, I asked neutral questions instead of moral ones. How would that read in an audit instead of, is that right? It kept things civil. It also made me feel safe. Safe people get trusted. Trusted people get used to it. There were others who noticed this dynamic, but no one named it out loud. In corporate environments, roles solidify silently. Someone becomes the fixer. Someone becomes the closer. Someone becomes the fall guy, though no one ever uses that word, at least not yet. At the time, I didn't think of myself that way. I told myself a simpler story, that I was building long-term credibility, that consistency mattered more than visibility, that eventually when leadership needed someone steady, my name would surface naturally. That belief kept me compliant longer than I cared to admit. When mistakes happened above my level, I was asked to help frame the response. When timelines slipped due to executive indecision, I was asked to smooth the narrative. When regulators asked uncomfortable questions, I was the one who assembled the documentation. Truthful, accurate, but carefully scoped. No one ever said, "This is on you." They didn't have to. The assumption was always there. Peter will handle it. Peter will absorb it. Peter won't make it personal. And I didn't. Not outwardly. What I didn't realize then was that every time I quietly accepted responsibility adjacent to power, I was teaching them something about me. I was teaching them that I could carry weight without protest. I valued stability over recognition, that I wouldn't disrupt the hierarchy, even when the hierarchy leaned on me a little too heavily. From their perspective, I was ideal. From mine, I was slowly disappearing inside a role I hadn't consciously chosen. The most dangerous part wasn't the workload or the disrespect. It was the normalization of it. When something unfair becomes routine, it stops feeling urgent. It starts feeling inevitable. And that's exactly where they wanted me. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. There's no drama, no raised voices, no clear line crossed. Just a moment that feels slightly off. Easy to dismiss if you're inclined to keep the peace. It was a quarterly review meeting. Senior leadership, legal, compliance, standard mix. I had spent weeks preparing the risk assessment for a new vendor integration, flagging concerns, documenting mitigation steps, and building a clean paper trail. When the slide deck came up, my work was there. My name wasn't. The VP presenting it spoke confidently, walking through the logic I'd written almost word for word. When a question came up about a potential exposure, he answered using a phrase I recognized immediately. It was from my internal memo. Not paraphrased, lifted. No one looked at me, not because they were being cruel, because in their minds this was normal. Work flowed upward. Credit consolidated at the top. Oh, the system functioned as designed. I remember feeling a brief flash of irritation, quickly followed by something more dangerous, rationalization. This is how it works, I told myself. Visibility comes later. At least the work is being used correctly. That internal dialogue mattered more than I realized, because in that moment I chose interpretation over intuition. I smoothed the edge before it could register as harm. A few minutes later, the CEO joined the discussion late. Someone summarized the risk posture. They used the VP's name when referring to the assessment. The CEO nodded, satisfied. I stayed silent. After the meeting, the VP clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good catch on that vendor thing. Glad we had you on it." It sounded like praise. It felt like containment. That was the first small cut. Not because my name was missing, but because a line had quietly shifted. My work had become transferable. My insight had become ambient, something that could be claimed without resistance. I noticed similar moments after that. An email where my analysis was forwarded upward, stripped of attribution. A follow-up meeting where decisions were justified using my earlier cautions, but framed as executive foresight. A compliance adjustment credited to leadership alignment. Each instance was minor. Each one is easy to ignore on its own. And everyone else did ignore them. Colleagues were friendly. Leadership remained polite. No one treated me poorly in a way you could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." That's how systems protect themselves. They never do enough damage at once to provoke resistance. They distribute it over time in amounts small enough to metabolize. I kept my composure. I kept delivering. I told myself I was being strategic, that reacting emotionally would only undermine the long game. But something else was happening beneath that calm. I started remembering, not obsessively, not angrily, just precisely. dates, phrases, who said what and when, which ideas traveled upward, and how quickly my name disappeared as they did. At the time, I didn't know why I was cataloging these moments. I only knew they felt important in a way I couldn't yet articulate. Looking back, that was the moment my role began to change. Not in their eyes, but in mine. Because once you notice the first small cut, you start realizing how many others you've already healed without acknowledging. And you start to wonder what would happen if you stopped bleeding quietly. Once something happens more than twice, it stops feeling like an exception. It becomes a pattern. I didn't wake up one morning and decide I was being disrespected. That realization arrived gradually, diluted by routine. The environment stayed professional. People stayed pleasant. That was part of the trap. Nothing felt hostile, so nothing demanded confrontation. What changed was subtler. Meetings where I used to be asked for input became meetings where I was asked for confirmation. Not, what do you think? But, we're aligned on this, right? My role shifted from contributor to validator. I was there to bless decisions, not shape them. When timelines tightened, pressure flowed downward. When risks surfaced, accountability did too. When things went well, success flowed upward, abstracted into leadership language. I noticed how often my work appeared in final materials with my fingerprints carefully wiped away. Not aggressively removed, just never added. Like I had never been part of the process at all. And still, I stayed quiet. I told myself a familiar story. Pick your battles. This isn't personal. You're being paid to solve problems, not seek applause. That story was comforting. It allowed me to keep functioning without friction. It also slowly taught everyone around me that my silence was consent. The normalization didn't come from one person. That's important. This wasn't a villain narrative. It was structural. Each person took a small advantage, assuming it was harmless. No one saw themselves as exploiting me. They saw me as a reliable infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't get thanked, it gets used. There was a moment that clarified this for me. A junior manager asked if I could quickly review a compliance summary she'd put together. I recognized it immediately. It was my work from months earlier, lightly rephrased. She had inherited it after a reorg. To her, it wasn't even mine. It was just part of the system. She wasn't disrespectful, she was efficient. I approved it without comment. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and realized something uncomfortable. I had trained them to treat me this way. Not consciously, but consistently. By absorbing impact without response, by smoothing over tension instead of naming it, by valuing harmony over authorship. And once a system learns that lesson, it doesn't unlearn it easily. The real danger wasn't that they dismissed me. It was then that I began dismissing myself, minimizing my own reactions, questioning whether I was overreacting, reframing disrespect as professionalism. That internal erosion is hard to see from the outside. It looks like maturity, like patience, like being above it. But inside, something was hardening. I started to feel less surprised by exclusion, less disappointed by omission, almost resigned, as if this was simply the cost of being the kind of person I was. That resignation should have scared me more than it did, because when disrespect becomes normal, it stops triggering defense. It stops activating boundaries. It becomes background noise. And background noise is easy to exploit. What I didn't yet understand was that this normalization wasn't accidental. It was preparatory. It was setting the conditions for something larger, something that required a person who wouldn't push back when responsibility quietly shifted in their direction. Someone dependable, useful, invisible. Someone like me. There's a moment in every long imbalance where you finally see the shape of it, not emotionally, structurally. For me, that moment came during a planning session I wasn't supposed to attend. I was only there because someone needed quick numbers and I happened to be nearby. I sat in, said nothing, listened. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that everyone in the room already knew who they were supposed to be. The visionary, the strategist, the closer, the peer. And then there was the role that never gets named out loud. The reliable constant. The one who absorbs variance. The person you lean on when things don't go as planned. precisely because they won't make it about themselves. That was me. They didn't describe me that way. They didn't have to. It was implied in how responsibility was distributed. High-risk decisions were framed as collective. Potential fallout was framed as operational, and operational, more often than not, landed on my desk. Not because I was the most senior, not because I had final authority, but because I was close enough to the work and far enough from the spotlight to carry consequences without destabilizing anyone above me. I realized then that my silence hadn't just been interpreted as professionalism. It had been interpreted as availability. Availability to take on extra accountability. Availability to explain things after the fact. Availability is the connective tissue between decisions and outcomes. In other words, I wasn't being overlooked. I was being positioned. The clarity was unsettling. It reframed years of interactions I had previously seen as neutral. The praise that emphasized my calm under pressure. The trust placed in me during sensitive moments. The quiet assumption that I would handle it. Handle what, exactly? At no point had anyone asked whether I wanted this role. It had been assigned the way roles always are in hierarchical systems, through repetition and reinforcement, not discussion. And the most uncomfortable truth was this: I had accepted it. Not explicitly, but functionally, because pushing back would have required friction. It would have disrupted the smoothness everyone valued. It would have forced people to confront dynamics they preferred to keep implicit. So instead, I stayed competent, I stayed calm, I stayed quiet. And in doing so, I became exactly what the system needed me to be. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. Anger clouds judgment. Alertness sharpens it. From that point on, I started paying closer attention, not to what people said about me, but to what they assumed I would do. Where responsibility defaulted. How quickly my name surfaced when something needed containment rather than celebration. The role was clear now. And once you see the role, you have a choice. You can reject it loudly and be removed, or you can inhabit it fully while preparing something else. At the time, I didn't yet know which path I would take. I only knew one thing for certain. If things ever went wrong at the highest level, they already knew who would be standing closest to the impact. And for the first time, I began to consider what it would mean to stop playing my part unconsciously. The shift didn't happen during a crisis. There was no emergency meeting, no explosive email, no sudden betrayal. In fact, the day itself was unremarkable. That's what made it so definitive. It didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with clarity. I was alone in a small conference room, reviewing a routine compliance log. The kind of task I'd done hundreds of times. Same templates, same language, same quiet responsibility. Halfway through, I noticed an inconsistency. A timestamp that didn't align. A decision was logged after an action had already taken place. Subtle, easy to overlook if you weren't looking carefully. I traced it back. The approval hadn't come from where it was supposed to. It had been retroactively assigned. The signature was technically valid, but the sequence told a different story. This wasn't negligence. It was an adjustment. I leaned back in the chair and felt something inside me settle. Not tense, not emotional, just still. As if a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Because suddenly, all those small moments made sense. The normalization, the role assignment, the quiet expectation that I would handle outcomes without asking how they came to be. This wasn't about trust. It was about insulation. And I was part of the insulation layer. What changed that day wasn't my behavior. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't flag the issue. I didn't even document it differently yet. What changed was my internal posture. Up until then, my silence had been reactive. I stayed quiet to avoid conflict, to preserve stability, to maintain professionalism. That day, silence became intentional. I realized I didn't need to announce my awareness. Awareness itself was leverage. And leverage only works if the other side doesn't know you have it. So I kept doing my job. Same demeanor, same responsiveness, same calm presence. But underneath, I stopped assuming good faith as a default. I replaced it with observation. Every decision started to look different when viewed through that lens. I began to see how ambiguity was preserved just long enough to be useful. How documentation was treated as a tool, not a truth. How certain risks were quietly externalized, waiting for the right moment to be assigned. And I understood something else too. If this ever surfaced, it wouldn't surface evenly. Responsibility would not be shared proportionally. It would be directed towards someone close enough to the work to be plausible and quiet enough not to resist. Toward me, that realization didn't scare me. It grounded me. Because once you accept that you are being positioned, you can stop reacting emotionally and start thinking structurally. You can decide whether to step out of the role or redefine it from the inside. That day, sitting alone in that conference room, I made a quiet decision. Not about revenge, not about exposure, but about readiness. If they were preparing an exit strategy, I would make sure it wasn't one-sided. And I would do it without changing my tone, my posture, or my reputation. The shift was invisible, but it was permanent. Once silence stops being reflexive, a change in his character. Before, my quiet had been a kind of accommodation, a way of keeping systems running smoothly, of absorbing friction so others didn't have to feel it. After that day, silence became deliberate, measured, strategic. And the interesting thing about deliberate silence is how easily it gets misinterpreted. People assume nothing had changed. Why wouldn't they? I still responded quickly, still delivered clean work, still didn't raise my voice in meetings or challenge decisions in public. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. From the inside, I was no longer filling in gaps blindly. I started choosing when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. I let certain ambiguities stand. I asked for clarification in writing instead of resolving things informally. I stopped preemptively fixing problems that hadn't yet been acknowledged. None of this was confrontational, it was procedural. And because it was procedural, no one objected. They mistook my restraint for passivity, my patience for compliance. In environments like that, people are conditioned to read confidence as volume. Quiet people get discounted automatically. That misreading worked in my favor. Meetings became more revealing when I spoke less. People filled the space with assumptions. Executives talked more freely when they thought they were among allies. Decisions were framed more openly when no one was challenging them in real time. I listened, not in a suspicious way, in a comprehensive way. I paid attention to how language shifted depending on the audience, how certainty appeared in private and softened in documentation, how risk was discussed as an abstract concept rather than a personal responsibility. And I noticed something else. My silence created a vacuum. In that vacuum, people began to explain themselves. They elaborated more, justified more, documented less carefully. When you assume someone isn't a threat, you stop being precise around them. That's when patterns become visible. I also began to formalize my own habits. Notes became time-stamped. Conversations were summarized and confirmed by email. Decisions that used to be handled verbally were gently nudged into written form. Not because I was building a case, because I was building clarity. And clarity, once it exists, can't be unseen. There's a misconception that power comes from confrontation. In reality, power often comes from patience, the ability to let others move themselves into positions they can't later explain. My silence allowed that. They continued assigning responsibility downward, assuming I would absorb it as I always had. They continued making decisions upward, confident that outcomes could be managed quietly. What they didn't realize was that silence had stopped being a cushion. It had become a mirror. And every time they spoke into it, they showed me exactly who they were preparing to protect and who they were preparing to sacrifice. I didn't rush that process. Rushing would have exposed me. Instead, I stayed exactly where they expected me to be. Reliable, calm, invisible. Waiting. Preparation doesn't look like preparation when it's done quietly. There were no late-night strategy sessions, no dramatic wall of evidence, no sudden personality shift that might have alerted anyone paying attention. Everything I did blended seamlessly into the role they already believed I occupied. That's why they never noticed. I didn't start collecting information. I already had access to it. My role sat at the intersection of operations, compliance, and reporting. I saw drafts before they were polished. I saw discussions before they were reframed. I saw decisions while they were still being tested for narrative viability. All I changed was how deliberately I observed. I began organizing my notes differently. not emotionally, chronologically. Dates, attendees, exact language used, what was said publicly versus what was said privately, what was documented versus what was assumed. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was looking for consistency. And what I found was a pattern of selective accountability. When initiatives succeeded, ownership flowed upward, abstracted into leadership vision. When risks materialized, responsibility flowed laterally and downward, framed as execution, failure. The same decision could be described in two completely different ways depending on the outcome. That kind of flexibility only works as long as no one maps it over time. So I did. I also paid attention to timing. Who insisted on urgency? Who delayed documentation? Who preferred verbal alignment over written confirmation? None of this was illegal, none of it was overtly malicious, but it was directional. I noticed how certain executives avoided being copied on emails that confirmed risk acknowledgement, how others deferred approvals until after actions were already underway, creating plausible deniability, how language like "we were aligned" replaced "I approved." They assumed this nuance would dissolve into organizational noise. It didn't, because I stopped treating each instance as isolated. I also adjusted how I responded when asked to just handle it. I asked one neutral follow-up question. Can you confirm this aligns with your earlier guidance? When given verbal direction, I summarized it politely in writing. Every response was calm, respectful, unremarkable. That was the key. Nothing I did felt defensive. It felt professional. In fact, several people thanked me for being so thorough lately. They thought I was protecting the company. In a way I was, but I was also protecting the truth. And truth has a way of becoming leverage when it's patiently preserved. What they never noticed was how their own words were slowly forming a closed loop. How each assumption, each causal deflection of responsibility was being anchored in time and context. They thought invisibility meant irrelevance. They didn't realize invisibility can also mean vantage point. I wasn't moving against them. I wasn't even moving toward anything yet. I was positioning myself so that when the narrative needed to be clarified, I wouldn't be standing alone. By the time the groundwork was laid, nothing I had was dramatic, but it was undeniable. And in systems built on ambiguity, undeniability is the most disruptive force there is. The moment I understood what I had didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, heavy, almost disappointing. I was reviewing a series of internal communications late one evening, cross-referencing them with audit logs I'd already organized. Individually, each item was mundane. Together, they formed something complete, a closed shape. That's when it became clear. I wasn't just holding information, I was holding a sequence. The timeline told a story no single document ever could. Decisions made verbally, actions taken immediately, approvals added later. Language softened after outcomes became known. Responsibility migrated depending on who was speaking. And at the center of that migration was a familiar destination. Me. I realized then that the meeting I hadn't yet heard, the one I would eventually record, was already implied by everything I was seeing. The groundwork for scapegoating doesn't start with accusation. It starts with positioning. By creating a narrative gap large enough for someone else to fall into. I sat there staring at the screen and felt a strange calm settle in. Not relief, not anger. Clarity. Because clarity strips things of their drama. It turns fear into logistics. Once you understand the structure, emotion becomes optional. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even feel validated. What I felt was the responsibility of a different kind. I understood that what I had could not be used casually. Pulling on this thread would unravel more than just one person's reputation. It would expose a way of operating that extended beyond any single individual. That's not a decision you make lightly. So I didn't act. I sat with it, tested my understanding, reran the sequence from different angles, asked myself what would happen if I were wrong. The leverage wasn't explosive. It was stable. That mattered. Explosive leverage forces immediate action. Stable leverage gives you time, and time is what I needed. Because the question was no longer whether I was being positioned as an exit strategy. The question was, what kind of person I would be when the moment arrived. Would I use what I had to shield myself quietly and let the system continue unchanged? Or would I allow the truth to surface in a way that forced accountability without spectacle? I didn't have to answer that yet. What mattered was this: I was no longer exposed. The asymmetry was gone. They didn't know what I knew, and I knew exactly how that knowledge fit together. The playing field hadn't tilted in my favor. It had leveled, and in that equilibrium, for the first time in a long while, I felt no urgency to move at all. Decision points are rarely dramatic. They don't arrive with urgency or music or a clear signal that this is the moment. They arrive quietly, disguised as the time. Time where nothing is demanded of you. Time where no one is watching. Time where the only real pressure comes from your own awareness. That's where I was. I knew what I had. I understood the structure beneath the surface. I could see with uncomfortable clarity how responsibility was being shaped, how narratives were forming long before any outcome forced them into the open. And for the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I laid out the options carefully, not emotionally. I treated them the way I treated everything else, methodically. The first option was the most tempting because it was the least disruptive. I could protect myself quietly. That wouldn't have required confrontation. Just subtle shifts. Redirecting emails, narrowing scope, making sure my name didn't sit too close to future risk. I could have become slightly less available, slightly more bound, without anyone calling it out. Plenty of people survive that way. But survival wasn't the question anymore, because survival would have meant accepting the underlying structure, that this was simply how things worked, and that the best outcome was personal insulation rather than systemic clarity. I knew I could do that. I also knew I wouldn't respect myself if I did. The second option was confrontation. Not loud, not emotional, just private. I could have requested a meeting, presented the timeline, asked for clarification, forced a recalibration before anything hardened into a narrative. It would have felt mature, responsible, even generous. But I understood something about people in positions of power. When confronted early, they don't correct. They adapt. They would have smiled, thanked me, reframed the situation as a misunderstanding, and then quietly restructured around the exposure point. The story would have changed. The behavior wouldn't have, and whatever protection I gained would have been temporary, dependent on their goodwill rather than truth. That left the third option, the one that felt least active and required the most discipline. I could do nothing, at least nothing visible. I could allow the process to continue, allow the assumptions to crystallize, allow the narrative to reach its natural conclusion. One where I was no longer just adjacent to risk, but positioned as the explanation for it. That option scared me, not because I doubted what I had, but because of what it required emotionally. It meant tolerating misinterpretation, sitting with the knowledge that people were planning without me, about me. It meant letting myself be underestimated one final time, but it was also the only option that removed ambiguity. Because there is a critical difference between suspecting someone might be scapegoated and watching the mechanism activate. Once the mechanism moves into place, it exposes everyone involved. I paid close attention to that distinction. If I acted too early, the story would be that I was defensive. If I acted too late, the story would already be written. Timing mattered more than action. So I waited, not passively, intentionally. I watched how discussions evolved, how certain executives began using language that softened responsibility before outcomes were known, how my role was referenced indirectly, process oversight, operational accountability, compliance alignment, language that sounded neutral, technical, unthreatening, language designed to point without accusing. I noticed how often I was described as closest to execution, despite not having final authority. How proximity was being equated with responsibility, how silence was being interpreted as consent. And that's when it fully crystallized. They weren't planning to blame me outright. They were planning to let the conclusion draw itself. No accusation, no confrontation, just a collective shrug that implied someone should have caught this, and an unspoken understanding of who that someone was. Once I saw that, the decision stopped being theoretical. Because defending yourself against an accusation invites debate. But revealing the architecture that created the accusation removes debate entirely. I didn't want to fight. I wanted inevitability. That meant letting them commit, letting emails be sent, letting meetings occur without me, letting language settle into records and memories. Because once people act on an assumption, they can't later claim it was hypothetical. They have to own it. That was the irreversible line, and crossing it wouldn't require me to push, only to wait. I won't pretend that was easy. There were moments, late at night, alone, when the instinct to intervene flared up. When I imagined how simple it would be to end the uncertainty, to force clarity immediately, but clarity too early would have protected them from themselves. I didn't want exposure. I wanted accountability that couldn't be softened, reframed, or negotiated away. So I stayed exactly where they expected me to be. Calm, professional, unassuming. I didn't signal awareness. I didn't change my tone. I didn't hint at what I knew. And slowly, predictably, they moved forward. That was the moment the decision became final. Not when I chose to wait, but when they chose to proceed. From that point on, the outcome wasn't a matter of strategy. It was a matter of timing. And timing finally was on my side. Once the decision was made, everything simplified. Not emotionally, logistically. There's a strange calm that comes when you stop debating whether to act and focus only on how not to be seen acting. That was the space I moved into. No urgency, no visible shift, just quiet execution. I didn't change my routines. I still arrived at the same time, still responded to messages promptly, still participated in meetings the way I always had, measured, concise, deferential when expected. That continuity mattered, because the most suspicious thing you can do in a system like that is suddenly become cautious. Caution signals fear. Fear signals awareness. I offered neither. What I did instead was move everything that mattered out of the informal realm. Conversations that would once have ended in hallway agreement now received gentle written follow-ups. Nothing accusatory, just summaries. Per our discussion, to confirm alignment, language that looked supportive but anchored memory to record. Approvals were no longer implied. They were acknowledged. Risk acknowledgements were no longer verbal. They were contextualized. I wasn't escalating. I wasn't flagging. I was standardizing. And because standardization is always sold as best practice, no one resisted it. In parallel, I took steps that had nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with positioning. I reviewed my contractual obligations, clarified reporting lines, ensured my scope of authority was precisely defined, not expanded, not diminished. Precision protects you when narratives get sloppy. I also began quietly disengaging from tasks that sat just outside my remit. Not abruptly, gradually. Each time I framed it as focus, not refusal. Given current priorities, to avoid overlap, language that sounded responsible, even helpful. No one objected. They assumed I was optimizing. Behind the scenes, I consulted professionals, not to plot, but to understand. Legal frameworks, compliance standards, documentation thresholds. What constituted evidence versus interpretation? I didn't share details, I asked hypotheticals. I wanted to know, if everything came to light, where clarity would land and where it wouldn't. That knowledge didn't change my behavior. It changed my confidence. And confidence, when quiet, is invisible. As weeks passed, subtle consequences began unfolding without attribution. Requests that once defaulted to me now require clarification. Decisions slowed slightly as documentation became unavoidable. Nothing dramatic, just friction where there had once been flow. No one traced it back to me. They couldn't. I was still doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, just no more than that. That was the final miscalculation on their part. They believed my value came from absorption, from my willingness to quietly carry excess weight. When that stopped, even subtly, the system began to strain. But strain takes time to register. By the time anyone noticed something was off, the structures they relied on had already adjusted. Records existed, roles were clearer. Assumptions had been quietly replaced with documentation. And I was still there, calm, present, unremarkable. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had already moved. The first signs didn't arrive as fallout. They arrived with hesitation. At first, it was barely noticeable, easy to dismiss as timing or workload. A meeting was postponed because someone needed to double-check alignment. An email thread that stalled while legal asked a question that months earlier would never have been asked. A decision that lingered in draft form instead of being finalized with a nod and a handshake. Small interruptions, in isolation, meaningless, together symptomatic. What the system was experiencing wasn't resistance, it was the sudden absence of absorption. For years, excess risk, unclear ownership, and narrative shortcuts had quietly settled into me. I'd been the buffer, unofficial, unacknowledged, but essential. When that buffer stopped flexing, the weight didn't disappear. It redistributed, and redistribution always reveals fault lines. Executives began asking questions they weren't used to asking, not out of curiosity, but out of discomfort. Who actually approved this? Was legal aware at the time? Do we have confirmation on record? These weren't accusatory questions. They were defensive ones. The tone had shifted from confidence to caution, and no one could quite explain why. The organization still looked functional from the outside. But internally, there was a growing sense that things no longer moved as effortlessly as they once had. I noticed how often my name surfaced in these moments. Not with blame, but with expectation. Peter usually has this documented. Let's check what Peter's notes say. Peter should know how this was handled. What changed was what happened after they checked. Because now, when they looked, there was no narrative padding. No interpretive smoothing. No helpful contextualization that made everything feel reasonable in hindsight. There were just facts, dates, emails, approvals, or the absence of them. I didn't editorialize. I didn't connect the dots for them. I simply provided what existed. That restraint unsettled people more than confrontation ever would have. They were used to me helping them understand what had happened. Now I was forcing them to see it, and seeing is heavier than understanding. The atmosphere in meetings changed subtly. People spoke more slowly, chose words more carefully, copied more stakeholders than before. Where discussions had once been fluid, they now felt tentative, like everyone was aware that the ground beneath them wasn't as stable as they'd assumed. What struck me most was how no one pointed outward. There was no single event to blame, no scandal, no announcement, just a growing awareness that the system was no longer forgiving imprecision. That awareness bred anxiety. I saw it in the way explanations grew longer and less focused, in the way people began defending decisions before anyone challenged them, in the way phrases like "to be clear" and "for the record" started appearing in conversations that used to be casual. And still, no one came to me directly, because what would they say? Was I being too accurate, too thorough, too compliant with the process? Nothing I was doing violated norms. In fact, it reinforced them. That was the quiet brilliance of it. The system had relied on my discretion to keep things smooth. Once that discretion became neutral, the system had to confront its own habits. And habits, when exposed, feel like threats. I also noticed something else, something more personal. People began testing boundaries. They asked questions that felt like probes, tried to get me to speculate, to soften language, to help interpret documentation in ways that favored continuity over clarity. I didn't refuse. I just didn't volunteer. And that absence of reassurance, of smoothing, of implied loyalty was felt immediately. The losses weren't public. They were internal. Confidence eroded. Momentum slowed. Trust shifted from assumed to conditional. They felt something slipping away, but they couldn't identify what it was, because nothing had been taken. Something had simply stopped being given. By the time leadership began sensing that a larger issue might be forming, they were already behind it. The documentation existed, the records were fixed, the assumptions they'd leaned on for years no longer held, and I was still there, still calm, still professional, still exactly who they thought I was. The difference was that now, when the system leaned on me, it no longer bent quietly, and that's when unease turned into concern. By the time they realized something was wrong, they were already trying to fix the symptoms. That's how you know it's too late. The questions started shifting in tone. Less exploratory, more urgent. People wanted reassurance, not about what had happened, but about what could still be controlled. There were sudden check-ins framed as alignment conversations, invitations to meetings that felt unnecessary, except for the fact that certain people needed to hear themselves speak out loud. testing whether the room still felt safe. It didn't. I could sense the recalibration attempts. Language softened, responsibility blurred again. Phrases like collective oversight and shared context resurfaced, as if repeating them might restore the old elasticity. It didn't. Because once documentation exists, it becomes a reference point. And reference points don't move just because the room wants them to. I noticed people attempting to retroactively clarify things that had never been ambiguous, only undocumented. Emails arrived weeks late, summarizing decisions long since acted upon. Calendars were revisited, memories were suddenly very detailed. Too detailed. That's another sign it's too late. When people begin reconstructing the past with urgency, it means the future has already narrowed. There were also private conversations happening, quiet ones, held behind closed doors. I wasn't invited to most of them. I didn't need to be. I could feel their effects ripple outward. People grew guarded, politeness sharpened. Some avoided eye contact. Others overcompensated with friendliness that felt rehearsed. Fear has a texture, and this wasn't fear of exposure yet. It was a fear of loss of control. At some point, someone realized that the usual safety valves weren't working, that the assumptions they'd relied on about who would absorb responsibility, who would contextualize outcomes, were no longer holding. I imagine that's when the meeting happened. The one I would later record, a closed-door conversation where options were discussed calmly, where names were considered not as people, but as variables, where it became clear that I wasn't part of the discussion. I was the solution to it. The exit strategy. What they didn't understand was that strategies depend on asymmetry. On one side, knowing more than the other. On silence remaining unbroken. That asymmetry was already gone. When the first overtures reached me, subtle, careful, framed as concern, I recognized them immediately. Attempts to re-anchor me emotionally. To restore the old dynamic where I would step in and stabilize things without asking questions. I responded the same way I always had. Calm, professional, precise. And that's when they knew. Not consciously, perhaps, but instinctively. Something had shifted too far to be undone. The room no longer moved around them the way it used to. They had waited too long to adjust. By the time they reached for me as a solution, I was no longer available in the way they expected. And from that point on, whatever happened next wasn't about fixing the situation. It was about managing the consequences. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly ordinary. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no accusations hurled across a table. Just a meeting request, phrased carefully enough to sound routine, but urgent enough to matter. A small conference room, the door closed, 2 executives, legal dialed in, muted. They began the way people always do when they're unsure who holds leverage, by talking around the issue. There were references to recent developments, to external pressures, to the need for clarity and alignment moving forward. Language designed to feel collaborative while quietly narrowing options. I listened. When they finally turned to me, it wasn't with an accusation, it was with a question framed as concern. Can you walk us through your understanding of how this unfolded? That phrasing told me everything. They weren't testing facts. They were testing me, gauging whether I would fill in gaps, whether I would soften edges, whether I would accept proximity as responsibility. I didn't. I answered simply, chronologically, without interpretation. I referenced dates, meetings, approvals. I cited emails they had sent, language they had used, decisions they had deferred. All of it factual. All of it is already documented. I didn't accuse, I didn't editorialize, I didn't raise my voice or sharpen my tone. I let the record speak. There was a long pause after I finished. The kind of pause where no one wants to be the first to respond because every response creates a record of its own. That's when I realized something important. They weren't angry. They were recalculating. The conversation shifted subtly. Questions became narrower. Statements are more careful, legal, unmuted. Someone asked whether I had concerns about how things were being characterized. I said, calmly, only that accuracy matters, especially now. That was the closest I came to confrontation. There was no denial, no attempt to push responsibility onto me directly. They couldn't. not without contradicting what was already on record. And that was the moment the narrative collapsed. Not dramatically, quietly, because once the story they'd been preparing couldn't be told cleanly, it ceased to be useful. The meeting ended politely, with thanks, with promises to follow up. I walked out the same way I'd walked in, calm, unrushed, unchanged. But the dynamic was over. They no longer spoke about me as if I were an option. I had removed myself from the equation without raising my voice. And that, more than anything else, marked the end of the role I'd been assigned. What changed afterward wasn't my title. It wasn't a dramatic exit, or a sudden promotion, or a public acknowledgement of anything that had happened. Systems like that don't reward disruption. Even when it's necessary, they stabilize, they move on. What changed was how I occupied my own life. For a long time, I had confused restraint with humility, silence with professionalism. I believed that being steady meant being absorbent, that strength meant making things easier for everyone else, even at my own expense. I don't believe that anymore. I still value calm, I still value precision, but I no longer offer myself as infrastructure. I no longer allow my silence to be used as a placeholder for consent. I speak when accuracy requires it, I stop when it doesn't. That distinction has become the foundation of who I am now. My work is cleaner, boundaries are clearer, responsibilities are named instead of implied. And when they aren't, I ask, not confrontationally, not defensively, but plainly. The people around me have adjusted, some with respect, some with distance, a few with quiet resentment. All of that is acceptable because the cost of being liked was too high when it required me to disappear. I don't feel triumphant about what happened. I don't replay the moments looking for vindication. The outcome didn't give me closure in the cinematic sense. What it gave me was alignment. My internal sense of self finally matches my external behavior. There's no split between what I see and what I say, only discretion about when to say it. And I still carry the notebook, I still document, not because I'm afraid, but because clarity is a form of respect for myself and for the truth. If there's a lesson here, it isn't about strategy. It's about presence, about recognizing the moment when silence stops protecting you and starts erasing you. About understanding that you can be calm without being compliant, patient without being passive. I didn't become louder. I became harder to misuse. And that has made all the difference. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to look for a villain, a single face to attach everything to, a moment where justice feels loud and satisfying. But that kind of ending would miss the point. What happened to me didn't happen because one person was cruel. It happened because systems reward convenience, and because silence, when it goes unexamined, becomes part of that convenience. No one woke up intending to make me the exit strategy. They just noticed I made things easier. And over time, ease replaced ethics. The real moral line in this story wasn't crossed in the closed-door meeting I recorded. It was crossed much earlier, in smaller moments, when responsibility was blurred instead of named, when credit flowed one direction and accountability flowed another, when my quiet professionalism was mistaken for unlimited availability. And I participated in that longer than I should have. That's the part I own. Because the truth is, silence is never neutral. It either protects something or enables something. And until we examine which one it's doing, we don't really get to call it integrity. What changed wasn't that I became aggressive or cynical or vengeful. What changed was that I stopped disappearing. I didn't demand recognition. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't expose anyone for spectacle. I simply refused to absorb consequences that weren't mine. And when you do that calmly, consistently, and without apology, something interesting happens. The system has to show its hand. Sometimes it adjusts. Sometimes it panics. Either way, the truth surfaces. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped carrying the weight that kept it buried. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim yourself. You don't have to burn bridges to enforce boundaries, and you don't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes the most decisive move is choosing when silence ends and what replaces it. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever realized you were being positioned to carry responsibility that wasn't yours? And if so, what did you do when you finally saw it? Feel free to share your experience in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.